Okay, so there has been a lot of drama. There's always a lot of drama. I could literally do a show every week on Christian Twitter soap opera. There's always some kind of controversy, hard feelings, and foolishness happening over on Christian Twitter or X. But in this week's episode, we're going to talk about in vitro fertilization, always a very emotional and difficult topic. I'm going to try to walk us through some things and to not just understanding what's happening right now, but to use the news events of what's happening right now as a means to teach you some things about how to think about this complicated and often emotional topic. And thank you, Susanna, saying I look nice today. Just slapped on some makeup. Hopefully it's working. Fish the earrings out of my desk, and voila, here I am. Okay. So we are going to talk about an editorial that appeared late last week on the Fox News website, and it was actually a reprint from an op-ed in a Dallas newspaper. The headline is, "I'm a pro-life pastor who is very thankful that the miracle of IVF," and IVF stands for in vitro fertilization, we're going to talk about that, "allowed me to become a dad." And the subtitle is, "Defending IVF will allow future parents to fulfill their God-given desire to nurture a child." And this is an opinion piece by a Dallas area pastor named Dr. Jeremiah J. Johnston. And there are a number of Jeremiah Johnstons out there. This is not I think there's one that even is like a charismatic Trump prophet or something. This is not that guy. This is a different guy. So we'll talk a little bit more about him as we go along. And then we are also going to read through some highlights of Katie Faust's response article to Dr. Johnston's article that appeared in the Federalist this morning. Pastor twists himself in knots to claim being pro-IVF is pro-life. A very provocative title from our friend Katie Faust. So I'm going to try to break it all down for you today. And hopefully this will be helpful. This is my hope. So this is going to be a bit of a freestyle type of episode. I just kind of have an outline. I don't have it completely scripted out because I just don't have time for that these days. But I wanted to hit some highlights for you and let you know about this controversy simply because, and for reasons that I'm going to continue to unfold throughout this stream, just how very practical and important it is, and that this issue of in vitro fertilization is really at the intersection of theology and real life. And I want to unpack that a little bit more for you today. But there is a growing movement, and Kevin Briggins and I talked about this last Saturday on All the Things. We went through a whole show about how to read a political platform. And one of the points that we made toward the end is that the Republican platform has made a shift to including the issue of being pro in vitro fertilization as part of the larger pro-life movement. And I have some concerns about that I want to go into more detail on. We only briefly touched on that in All the Things. And so I want to explain that a little bit more. But I also want to let you know that I am not new to the IVF conversation. This is an issue that has been a concern of mine that I feel like has needed more public conversation for 30 years. Ever since I took a class in ethics, which a large portion of that class was on medical ethics back in seminary in the early 90s, I have known that this was an issue that needed more awareness among evangelical Christians, but there were really very few voices who've spoken out about it. Yeah, there's like your little one-off academic pieces, or you might get an article on the Gospel Coalition website here and there, but there hasn't been anybody who's really making these issues a central focus. And I think that uh, we need more conversation about this issue, especially among pastors, because a lot of pastors are not informed, so they don't know how to counsel their people. And yet, many of the people in their pews are experiencing infertility and seeking out solutions related to IVF without even having an awareness of some of the ethical problems and implications for their worldview. And I'm always an advocate for people having a more integrated worldview. And I realize that, that's why ministries like mine exists and other people who are in this space, that we are trying to help people have a more consistent and biblically integrated worldview. And so that's really the spirit and nature of this conversation. And I really appreciate already some of you are jumping in the comments with your experiences with IVF. I will look forward to reading those. And I have a listener here who agrees with me. Yes, pastors need to be teaching on it. And that is going to be a point I am going to circle back to toward the end of the stream. So I look forward to engaging you on this topic. And I'm going to try to explain things as calmly as I can, as carefully as I can, as nuanced as I can. But you have to understand that sometimes you can kind of nuance something to death. So I'm going to try to speak in broad principles here. I am not speaking to you personally. So don't take it personal if I say something that hits you hard. I'm not trying to be condemning. I am rather trying to explain a biblical worldview and some of the wisdom that relates to and connects to this issue for you to then wrestle with the help of the Holy Spirit and to see what is there for you. Okay. So before I get into this op-ed piece by Dr. Jeremiah J. Johnston, I want to make a few preliminary comments about the Christian worldview and the intersection of infertility and the seeking of IVF or infertility, in vitro fertilization treatments. Now, the first thing I want to say, and I want this to be an overarching ethos to our whole conversation today, is that I understand, based on the many, many interactions and letters that we have received over the years as we have tried to have this public conversation about these issues, many of you have reached out to us telling us your stories. And I know that dealing with infertility problems can be very emotionally difficult and painful, and that the pain of that impact, I think, sometimes connects differently of men versus women. Both find it challenging in different ways. I think sometimes women often have a particular vulnerability of thinking about their inability to conceive, that somehow that undermines their worth or their value as a woman and a wife. And especially since, in light of teaching on Genesis 1 and 2, that's what our bodies have been created to do. And you are certainly not alone in that pain. I want to affirm those of you who have had reproductive challenges and to think about, and meditate on this scripture from Samuel chapter 1, the story of Hannah. We just read this last week as a family in our family devotions. And it's such a great passage to meditate on with this particular issue of infertility. There were two wives with one husband, which is already a setup for a difficult situation. And one of the wives was named Penina, and she had sons and daughters. But to Hannah, the other wife, who was really the favored wife of the what was his name? Elkanah, son of Jehoram. Um, that he had a wife named Hannah, and he shared whenever he would go to the sacrifice, he would bring home meat from the sacrifice. This was the custom, and he would give a double portion to Hannah. And it says in verse 5 of 1 Samuel chapter 1, he would give her a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. What an interesting and sensitive description that the text has here. And then it goes on to say, because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. And this went on year after year. It describes Hannah's weeping about this, her wounded feelings. And then one time she goes up to Shiloh, to the tabernacle, and Eli, the priest, sees her praying there. And notice the description here in verse 10. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly about her lack of children. What a deep pain it was for Hannah to experience that. And Eli thinks that maybe she's drunk because she's kind of praying silently. And she says, no, I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord, in verse 15. Verse 16, do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli has compassion on her at this point. He says, go in peace, and may the Lord of Israel grant you all that you have asked of him. And sure enough, when we get to verse 20, so in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. And so, infertility is not a new problem. It's not a unique problem. It is a problem that many women face, not just today, but also in the ancient world. And I think it's important to have perspective on that. Is whatever we are experiencing is not grief or anguish that is uncommon to humanity. What we are experiencing today is women have experienced over thousands of years. And so, so that's something I just want to bring your attention to. Like, I recognize the struggle, and nothing I want to say today should be seen as any sort of condemnation or a lack of understanding of the struggle. And yet we have to have some hard conversation about biblical principles. Okay. There's also, from a biblical perspective, I would argue, an underlying assumption in the Bible that childbearing is a result of the providence of God. It is ultimately the decision of God to open and close wombs. Now, this is a very difficult teaching for us today as living in a postmodern world. We like to think of ourselves and our level of technology as being sovereign over our bodies and sovereign even over things that, well, maybe historically and primitively, there have been no medical interventions that could make this happen. But now we live in a different age. We're more progressive. We have more understanding. And so I think that there is a tendency to just jump immediately to what's medically possible without, as Christians, taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about the worldview of the Bible. And that there is this overarching operating assumption that God is the one who opens and closes wombs. And that even miracles can happen around wombs. Think of Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1. Think of Was it Rachel who God finally opened her womb and she had Joseph and then Benjamin? There is this assumption that it is God who does these things. And so we have to, if we're going to think about conception worldviewishly, if we're going to think about fertility worldviewishly, we have to understand that we are standing in a 21st century American context of high technology and wealth and prosperity that makes new things possible. How do we balance that with the biblical perspective that there is this underlying assumption that God is the one who creates life? Okay? And so we want to think about that. Yeah, also Susanna says also think about Sarah. There's another supernatural birth, supernatural opening of the womb. And that is a theme in scripture. And I would say to those women who struggle with fertility, to first and foremost cry out to God. That's not to say don't go see your medical doctor. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't investigate what the struggles, what may be causing the struggles, and maybe that there is some thing that can be done, um, to help with the hindering of fertility. Not saying don't explore those things, but you're gonna, I think, to have a biblical and integrated biblical worldview, you're gonna have to do that with the underlying foundational assumption in mind that you are not ultimately in control, the medical doctors are not ultimately in control, that ultimately it is God, and he might be inviting you to call out to him first, just as Sarah or Hannah or Elizabeth. Okay. Another point, foundational point I want to make, and we'll get right into the article in just a minute here, but I do think that if we're going to think worldviewishly, we've got to take a couple minutes to develop our framework, is that every child is a result of the providence of God. It says in Psalm 139 that children in the womb are fearfully and wonderfully made. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5 talks about how God knew Jeremiah even when he was in the womb, and then he had a plan for him to be a prophet to the nations. So we must understand that life is the result of the providence of God. And this is a very important thing for us to wrestle with. Now, that's not to say, and I have my wrestle too. There are scriptures in the Bible that I wrestle with too, of like, I don't like this verse, or this is very hard for me. It's very emotional for me. And it's a struggle and I have to be in it. Okay. So we all might have issues that we must struggle through. And that is part of the Christian life, but it might be a different issue for each person. Okay. So these are some of the things that I want to point out, that all life is the result of the providence of God. So nobody is arguing that children conceived through in vitro fertilization are less than human or have less dignity than children conceived in the natural way. Nobody is arguing that point. Okay. Every child is beautiful. Nothing I'm going to say today is about the value of your particular child or grandchild. If they were conceived through in vitro fertilization, they are beautiful, they are valuable, they are created in the image of God with hope, purpose, and destiny. Okay. Now, with all of that said, we are going to talk about some biblical principles and the application of these things so that we can have an integrated biblical worldview. The final point I want to make is that I see in vitro fertilization as a justice issue. And here's why. I think every Christian needs to think through the ethics and theology related to in vitro fertilization. Why is this a justice issue? Because it involves the most vulnerable among us. We're talking about If you believe that life begins at conception, we're talking about life in petri dishes of sorts, in labs. These are the most vulnerable among us. They have no voice to protect them. And so when we think about injunctions from scripture, such as Proverbs 31, it says, speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. I'm going to add to that really quick. James chapter 1, another principle that I think is important for us to consider in this conversation. James chapter 1, verse 27, it says, religion that our God accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. To look after an orphan is a justice issue. It is one without parents. It is the most vulnerable among us that we must speak up for. We need to be a voice for the voiceless. And this is why I think IVF is a justice issue that every Christian, every pastor, every Christian school administrator, every elder, every deacon, every person in the pew needs to take time to think about, because what we're going to see is that around 97% of the children conceived through in vitro fertilization don't make it. They're disposed of. 97%. Now, we'll talk about some exceptions in the technology. We'll get there. But I want you to understand that if we are going to be a voice for the voiceless, this is a justice issue. And this is why we must talk about it. Okay? No, it's going to be hard. And I know that for some of you, this might be a difficult conversation. Hopefully, you'll keep all of my caveats in mind. Okay, now with that, let us take a look at this article on the Fox News website, this op-ed by Dr. Jeremiah J. Johnston. Now, really quickly, who is Jeremiah J. Johnston? Well, he has a veritable alphabet soup behind his name. PhD, MA, MDiv, BA. He's very educated. He is described as being a New Testament scholar, pastor, author, nationally syndicated radio host, Bible teacher, and apologist. And he ministers internationally as the president of Christian Thinkers Society. That's the website that I'm reading this from. Jeremiah loves the local church, and he also serves as the pastor of apologetics and cultural engagement at Prestonwood Baptist Church and the dean of spiritual development at Prestonwood Christian Academy. Now, if you don't know about Prestonwood Baptist Church or Prestonwood Christian Academy, these are fairly huge entities. Prestonwood Baptist Church, I would characterize as being a mega church. This is a person of great influence and education. Okay. And so this is not a person who is not educated. He's an apologist. He's a New Testament scholar. So here's how I think about this. I have a lot of grace and compassion for the person in the pew who, without proper counsel and without proper discipleship, had no idea what the ethical implications of in vitro fertilization are. They call themselves pro-life, but they've participated in this, and they feel regret. Many of those people have written to us over the years. Or maybe this person just doesn't know. Nobody's ever sat them down and said, hey, have you really thought this all the way out, from a scientific perspective. Here's what happens. And then here's some of the ethical implications of that. I have tons of compassion for those kinds of people. This is not a condemnation for those people. Where I have harder questions is when I'm talking about leaders. When I'm talking about thought leaders that I feel like, this is confusing to me. How maybe you haven't thought this all the way through. I'm concerned. I have questions. But when you put yourself out there as a thought leader and then you write an opinion piece that gets published on Fox News, you are putting yourself out there as someone that you want people to listen to, as a person of influence. This is where I get a little bit more vocal about my concerns. Because in my mind and in my way of thinking, and I say this with all due respect and humility toward Dr. Johnston, I don't know Dr. Johnston. He's probably never invited me to speak at chapel at Prestonwood Christian Academy. But, I have concerns that some of the views that he holds are, in my opinion, very deeply troubling and against the Christian worldview. And so I'm a little more publicly, I don't want to use the word critical because that has such a negative connotation these days, but I am challenging of people when they are thought leaders. Okay. So let's get into the op-ed here. And we're just going to read a few highlights. You can go read it for yourself. This is a live link, so it is still up. And we will read a few highlights from this. Starts off with, in vitro fertilization is widely accepted as a blessing to parents of all religions and political persuasions. Thankfully, Governor Greg Abbott, who is the governor in Texas, where Dr. Johnston resides, strongly supports access to IVF. And the reason he's probably mentioning this is because this op-ed was originally published in the Dallas, I think Dallas Morning News or something, some Dallas affiliated newspaper. And he is right. It is universally accepted as being a blessing. But an Alabama court decision reignited questions about personhood of embryos that had been put to rest years ago. I'm a skeptic of this claim. I don't think it was put to rest years ago for reasons that we will get into. I think that's an opinion, but I don't think it's, I question this claim. I don't think it was put to rest. Unfortunately, a small but vocal minority, I guess that's yours truly, I am the small and vocal minority, have fixated on this position, and it certainly has been no help to the pro-life cause or to families struggling with infertility. Now, I get it. Like, there are some ways that we can talk about infertility that seem very uncompassionate, very condemning, very judgmental. And that's why I just spent 20 minutes talking about having compassion for people who are struggling with infertility. That's not what this is about. But at some point, we have to talk about the principle. And so we want to be careful with our words. We want to say things compassionately. But at some point, people are going to have to be strong enough to have the hard conversation if they're Christians and they want to have a fully integrated world view. So, all right, let's continue. Women struggling with infertility are being shamed with religious jargon, where some claim IVF lacks the mystery of natural conception, in air quotes. I don't know where he's getting that from, or that children conceived through IVF are less than human. Now, to my knowledge, could there be somebody on the internet who makes this claim that children conceived through IVF are less than human? Anything's possible. There are some people with oddball beliefs out there in the universe. But to be very transparent, I've never heard a major leader in the pro-life conversation make this claim. So I don't know where he's getting this. Um, it just seems like a little bit of a straw man-y kind of claim that people in the pro-life leaders in the pro-life community are saying that children conceived through IVF are less than human. I've never heard a major leader in the pro-life community make this claim. This seems a little straw man-y. Again, could there be a random person? Sure. I'm sure that this, if we looked hard enough somewhere in the universe, there would be somebody making that claim. The topic of infertility is intrinsically personal and often painful, especially for women. I understand. My wife, Audrey, and I should know there are few things as difficult in a marriage as infertility. It's assumed that if you're married and desire children, you'll be able to have them. That wasn't the case for us. Many people struggle with infertility, as I've stated. We struggled with infertility painfully for 5 long years. We tried everything. We saw marriage counselors. We met with fertility specialists, attended prayer meetings, and I'm sure all of that was a difficult journey for them together as a couple. All the while, our friends seemed to get pregnant easily. Social media only added to our pain. Having negative pregnancy tests month after month was difficult. All of these challenges that we faced. Okay. Eventually, we came to a crossroads. We could give up or we could pursue the modern medical miracle of IVF. And he has a very positive view toward IVF, calling it a modern medical miracle. I have a lot of thoughts about this claim, but I think I'll just pass on that. As it had already been during our doctor appointment, science and faith came together as our quest to become pregnant. Our relationship with God was essential, and we were inspired to do everything we could to become pregnant, which meant financial and emotional risk of IVF. Now, here's where I think he starts getting into assumptions that, God was in it, God was behind it, God's in the IVF, and this is an outcome of their relationship with the Lord. With all due respect, that's an assumption. That might be true. I don't know. I have questions. So eventually they get pregnant, they have 5 kids, and all of that. And so here is the troubling part we get to. What a handful of lawmakers and a few judges fail to understand is that an embryo doesn't always transform into a pregnancy or develop a child. That's very true. Sometimes the body rejects it. Sometimes, this might be a version of a miscarriage. These things can happen, whether it's entirely in the womb or with the help of medical procedures like IVF. Now, here's the controversial claim that he makes, what he's leading up to. An embryo is not synonymous with a child. That was true even before IVF existed. Only when an embryo successfully attaches in a mother's womb does a child begin its beautiful journey to soon living an independent life. Now, I was sort of with him when I first read this article up until this paragraph. And then I'm like, wait, what? What is he claiming here? That an embryo is not synonymous with a child. It is only when an embryo successfully attaches to the mother's womb, technically, I guess, that they're pregnant, and that the beautiful journey of living an independent life begins. I find this deeply troubling. Now, I'm not a doctor. We've had Dr. Chris on our show. You can go watch those episodes where she breaks it all down medically. She's a board certified OBGYN. We had her on, I don't know, a year and a half or so ago. She explained all the pregnancy things and the medical things and how it all works. But I'm just a regular person. So I'm going to give you the regular person's perspective on this. From the time of conception, that embryo has its own unique DNA. If it is left undisturbed, it has at least the potential to become a child. It already is a child, but to become fully formed and developed, just as once you're out of the womb, you continue to form and develop into toddlerhood and childhood and teenagerhood and adulthood and senior living. I mean, all the stages of life. And so what happens in the womb is just another stage of life. If we don't kill it, if we don't freeze it and we don't throw it away, we don't dismember it, it's a child and it's gonna live. And it already is a living being, and its species is human, and it has its own unique DNA. Now, I'll grant you, the life is small. We're only a few, days to weeks into the life of that embryo. But to say that it's really not, I don't know, like not a real, I don't think he wants to say and he says an embryo is not synonymous with a child. Well, how are we defining child? It's a human. It's on its way into growing. If left unhindered, it will have a contiguous path forward to development. But to say that, well, the life doesn't really begin until the implantation in the womb, that for me was a big red flag. And, he goes on to say that the embryo, I'm going to read this paragraph because I think it's interesting. He says, I say this as a pro-life individual who believes every life is sacred and precious. I appreciate this point. We agree on this point. Every life, every human life is created in the image of God, has inherent dignity, value, and worth, is sacred and precious. We agree on that. What I've learned from endocrinologists, I think he doesn't mean endocrinologists. I think he means embryologists. Maybe have a little question there. Maybe somebody with the science background can help me out here. Many sharing the same faith that I do, I might add, is that a handful of outliers claiming an embryo in and of itself is the beginning of pregnancy simply misunderstand the process. Well, call me an outlier. I don't know. Maybe I should put that in my lower third today. I'm the outlier. I'm the crazy person who believes that an embryo is actually the beginning of pregnancy. Now he's making a claim that I've misunderstood the process. Okay, we could debate that claim, but yeah, this is confusing to me, and this claim is not, I think, consistent with a true pro-life position. And he goes on to say something that is very true. He acknowledges that using IVF has a high failure rate. Over the course of time, before a natural pregnancy even begins, multiple embryos will likely have attempted to attach the womb. As future parents try to have children, only 25% of the time are they successful. And with IVF, multiple embryos are often needed to have the blessing of success for the pregnancy to officially begin. But there's a weird, in my opinion, I'm sorry for using the word weird. It's an equivocation here, though, that I want to draw your attention to. I don't think there's a one-on-one correspondence to a naturally ending pregnancy that just doesn't take, if you will, it doesn't implant in the womb, in the uterus, versus harvesting a bunch of eggs, fertilizing them, and then having them as backups If you implant some and they all fail, then you have some more that you can implant. But if the first batch does implant, then what do you do with those leftovers? I don't think those are morally equivalent situations, where something that happens naturally versus something that is happening artificially. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not a doctor. I could be wrong about that. But that strikes me as with a question of, I'm not sure that those are morally the same things. Okay. So this is I had a lot of questions after reading this. So I went on Dr. Johnston's Instagram account. He was interacting in the comments with people. And I thought, well, I've written some things that people misunderstand. And I realized later in hindsight, wow, I could have been more clear, or I could have done a better job communicating this. So I'm going to go on his feed and Instagram and see if maybe he was unclear. Maybe he didn't use the best words. Maybe he's clarifying his position. No, he's doubling down. He wants to use the cover story of, well, I only had 800 words, but what he's presented here, he's standing 10 toes down behind what he is saying. And so I appreciate his clarity. I appreciate that he's being clear about his position and he's standing by it, and that's great. But my hope was that maybe he was just unclear or confused, but that didn't seem to be the case in the comments. And he really truly wants to hold a position that IVF is part of the pro-life position. And so I think that there's just a lot of questions that I would have about his position. I'm trying to remember, and if anyone has been on his comments, tell me whether he limits the use of the IVF procedures to biological parents. I don't know if he spoke to that. I don't think he spoke to that in the article. Another question he didn't say is how many embryos that they harvested, how many are frozen. He did make a comment on Instagram that they have a provision in their will to give those embryos up for adoption in the event of their death, which I have some concerns about that position as well. But I think that my concern with that is that you're setting that child up to be raised from the get-go without an attachment to their biological parents. I think that from an ethical perspective is a deeply problematic position, in my humble opinion. So yeah, it was confusing. It was perplexing. I had a lot of questions. And no, I don't think I agree with Dr. Johnston on these issues. All right, before we get into Katie's article, I want to take a look at the comments here. And let's see. Angelica, sorry, is asking, how would you minister to a young woman who has gone through IVF and is a young believer and looks at children as being a blessing for God? We're going to cover that toward the end of the stream, so stay tuned. Thank you, Ashley. She likes my shirt. This was the June 2024 design for Pride Month. We've done that the last couple of years of having a special limited edition Pride Month shirt. And so this was our one for this year as a special mid-year fundraiser. Let's see. I want to make a comment here about Susanna's comment of IVF feels like people are playing God. I think that this is a comment that we have to be careful about in talking about it in a nuanced way, because there's a way I agree with you and there's a way that I disagree with you. If we're talking about the creation of life, I think we get into very difficult waters. And I'm going to talk toward the end of the stream about a narrow way that I think IVF could be ethically used, but it has a lot of terms and conditions. I think that the way that IVF is used most of the time is really, it's just the human will. This is what I want. And this is a technology that allows me to get what I want. And so I'm going to do it as long as I have the money and the means. That's where with all due respect, people who might disagree with me, I do think that there is a version of that, of playing God, that I will create life simply because I want it. If I compare that attitude with the attitude that I was mentioning earlier of the attitude of what I would say is kind of the underlying operational belief that God providentially brings about life, I do see those postures as being in conflict with each other. Where I would kind of disagree with this idea of playing God is that we do regularly take life-saving measures through modern medicine. I am the beneficiary of that. I've almost died twice in my life. And being in a position, I'm very grateful for modern medicine in allowing my life to continue so that I could raise my children and be with my husband and develop a teaching ministry. I'm grateful that my life was able to be saved. So is that also playing God? Like, there are some medical interventions that we do that extend our lives. And yet then there's other medical interventions that we do not participate with at times because it just seems to go too far. And these will continue to be big questions with the growth of transhumanism. We did a show about that a few years ago and all the things. You can go back and watch that. As we see advances happening through genome alterations. And so we are going to continue to wrestle with these issues. And I have to tell you that I am a skeptic of using a lot of these technologies because I do think it is a slippery slope. I'm just going to put that out there. That's my opinion. And yes, there is a narrow way in which this technology of IVF can be used ethically. We'll talk about that. But I think by and large, the default practice in big fertility is to do it in an unethical way. So there's that. All right. Just reading through the comments a little bit more. And this debate is so emotionally charged, but we as Christians owe it to set aside our emotions as best we can and really discuss it. The stakes are too high not to do so. I agree. Amanda says personhood of embryos is at the heart of the abortion debate. I agree. And that's really what we're talking about here is I do think embryos are persons. They're humans. They're, and they have inherent value, dignity, and worth, even if they are just at the beginning of their lives. Okay. Wow, lots of comments. All right, I'm going to keep going here. I know that this is running long. Sorry about that. It's just a lot to cover. Okay, let's get into Katie Faust's response. Now, I'm going to talk about Katie Faust. If you don't know Katie Faust, she heads up a ministry called Them Before Us. You can go to her website, check her out. We did a show with her a few months ago on big fertility. It's a very eye-opening show. I don't know if any of my moderators are on here, but if someone wants to grab that link from all the things, that would be a great follow-up to this conversation. And very, very eye-opening stream where we went deep into IVF and surrogacy. Now, I get it that Katie is not everyone's cup of tea, all right? She has a strong personality. She's very outspoken, and she can come on pretty strong. Many people have given us the feedback that they hear what she says as accusatory and condemning. We've had many people write to us over the years with those kinds of words, that they feel judged by her, that they don't like her, and they don't like her tone. These are all things that she hears on the regular. None of this surprises her. Here's how I think about Katie and what she's up to. I see her ministry as kind of being in the spirit of the Old Testament prophets. She is an annoying alarm clock that you have to get out of your warm bed in the morning and walk across the room and get it and slam it to get it to shut up. Like, this is sort of how I see Katie Faust, is like, she's trying to sound the alarm that nobody wants to hear. Nobody wants to have this conversation. It's hard. It's emotional. People's feelings are going to get hurt. And here's this woman making all these media appearances and writing books and doing all this stuff. And she is absolutely clear about her advocacy for the unborn, to the point that it annoys people. Okay. But if we were to talk to Elijah or Isaiah or Jeremiah, I have a feeling that we wouldn't like their tone either, because part of the job of a prophet is to call people back to the covenant. And in my personal opinion, this is the prophetic sense of the gift of prophecy for today. Is not about foretelling the future. Everyone's obsessed with that. I actually think that the gift of prophecy is more about calling people back to covenant faithfulness, like the Old Testament prophets. And Katie is going hard because she wants to save lives of the most vulnerable among us. So, like her or hate her, that is her posture. I encourage you to read her books and decide for yourself. Okay. But this morning in the Federalist, Katie published a pretty hard hitting piece about the op-ed by Dr. Johnston. So her headline in the Federalist this morning was, "Pastor twists himself in knots to claim being pro-IVF is pro-life." I'm just going to hit a few highlights here of this discussion and what Katie says. As usual with matters of marriage and family, the adult frames himself and his wife as victims. Johnston details the suffering they've experienced due to infertility. While infertility is incredibly painful when we get IVF wrong, or any parenthood question, it's the hundreds of thousands of lives discarded and frozen by the fertility industry who are the actual victims, not the adults. Now, this is a hard word. This is a hard word, but let's consider it. Okay. Is it true? We don't, in our postmodern American mindset, we don't want to think that, like, well, I'm painting myself as the victim. That's just not how we want to think about ourselves. And yet Katie comes on strong with this assertion, this claim that when parents are telling their stories and trying to, in her mind, give rationale for why they participate in IVF, that it paints them as the victim. And what she's trying to highlight is, no, actually the child is the victim. Now, some people are going to disagree with her. Some people are not going to like it. But here's what I appreciate about what Katie is doing, is she has made me think differently about this. I'm just being honest. Like, I never really thought about how the child is the true victim. Maybe I'm just slow, but her beating this drum has caused me to become more aware of who is the real victim in this story. And so I think that it's a hard word. I'm only asking you to try it on. pray about it, think about it, and that sort of a thing. Okay, let's continue here. I don't know what his pastoral duties have involved, but my Baptist pastor turned Navy chaplain husband and I have been in ministry for 30 years. And I'll tell you something true. Everyone suffers. Nearly every Christian I know has some longing, let's call it a thorn in their side, to which God says, "My grace is sufficient for you." Whether it's unwanted same sex attraction, unwanted singleness, longing for a healed marriage, a wayward son, a disabled daughter, chronic illness, or infertility. It's hard to name a Christian to whom God doesn't seem to be saying, "Not this side of heaven." I had to take a breath after reading that. Okay. This to me was one of the most compelling parts of Katie's response. And I think it's worthy of us to slow down and reflect it. It's, because we all have struggles. And if you don't have a struggle in your life, congratulations. But many of us all have some big issue that we struggle with. I struggled with a particular disability for 30 years. It's a long road, okay? Everyone has a struggle, a deep struggle, a big struggle. And infertility is like that thing that for Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, that she cried out in anguish to the Lord. And don't we all cry out in anguish to the Lord for our situation? And I think that it can be soul crushing at times when we have our struggles. And so I think that Katie is offering a word of caution that's worth trying on, weigh it out, that infertility, as painful as it is, as difficult as it is a thing that we all struggle through in our own way on some issue, and that in some cases might be God's answer to us is not what we want. We want healing. We want wholeness. We want to not deal with this difficult thing anymore. And we have to reflect on, to what degree am I using my pain, my difficulty? She's challenging us. Am I using that as a cover story, as a means to an end to participate in IVF in a way that may not be ethical or to center the child? Am I putting my needs before the child's needs? And that's why her ministry is called Them Before Us. In other words, them children, the child's needs get considered before my needs and my pain as an adult. This is a hard word, okay? But I'm putting it out there to try to challenge you to think about, pray about, and to consider, okay? All right, let's continue. I wanted to highlight here, Johnston communicates a misunderstanding of God's will for his people. Oh, let's go back a little bit. Yes, yet that's the path Johnston and his wife traveled, pursuing the modern medical miracle of IVF, and even suggesting that God inspired them to do everything they could do to become pregnant. Here, Johnston communicates a misunderstanding of God's will for his people. The Lord does not inspire us to fulfill our own desires regardless of the cost, especially if it forces the weak to sacrifice for the strong. Rather, God mandates that his people defend children. This is my point earlier about defending the helpless, the voiceless. And so Katie is challenging the mindset that, well, just because I want something and I have a need and it seems like it will be meaningful to me, Is that really in the best interest of the child? This is a hard word, okay? So let's continue. Hopefully this is helping someone. Let me know if it is. Okay. Johnston then erects several well-stuffed straw men. The apologist claims women struggling with infertility are being shamed with religious jargon to which some claim IVF lacks the mystery of natural conception, or that children conceived through IVF are less human. I highlighted this point earlier. Katie says, I work closely with the most staunch pro-life and therefore IVF critical voices, including Allie Beth Stuckey, Lila Rose, the Colson Center, Kristen Hawkins, Seth Gruber, and Stephanie Gray Connors. After checking my notes, I found that exactly zero say or believe that IVF babies are less than human. In fact, we repeatedly state every child born through IVF is precious, worthy of protection. We are so serious about child dignity that it forms the basis of our IVF opposition. We have the audacity to actually believe that every child created via IVF deserves protection, including the 93 to 97% who do not make it through the process alive. And this is the heart of Katie's concern. She says, I want to be totally consistent with my pro-life ethic. And if I'm going to be consistent, abortion termination is not our biggest problem. Our biggest problem of terminating innocent human life is IVF. Because that process, and I'm going to encourage you to do some homework and some research on how the process works. But at every stage of the process, children will be discarded. Okay? Unless you do it in this very narrow way, which I'm going to get to. Okay? But in almost all cases, 93 to 97% of these children are discarded. And Katie says, I want to be so consistently pro-life that I'm even acknowledging the humanity of embryos. I'm acknowledging their humanity even before they are planted in the womb, and that someone has to be a voice for the voiceless. This is a tough teaching, okay? Currently, if you go on to read the article, 1.5 million embryos are in perpetual storage right now. There are some of these are deemed not genetically fit, or they're the wrong sex. And so the problem here is one of child victimization. This is Katie's primary concern. Okay. So, let me move forward here. Johnston then takes a page from supporters of abortion by seeking to redefine the pro-life position. The whole purpose of being pro-life, says Johnston, is to see the value in children and help moms and dads enjoy their God-given ability to raise them. Can you notice the wording here? How adult-centered the wording is? This is what Katie is trying to draw our attention to. She says, no. The whole purpose of being pro-life is to protect children's lives from forces seeking to snuff them out, because adult desire is being elevated above their fundamental right to life. And unfortunately, when it comes to embryonic children, the baby-making industry of IVF is racking up numbers that surpass the baby-taking industry of abortion. This is Katie's primary concern. She is trying to sound the alarm that if you're worried about abortion, baby murder, you haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the level of baby murder until you think about IVF. Now, whether you agree with Katie or not, I want you to just simply understand her point and what she is trying to say. And she's trying to draw our attention to this very adult centered, these are my needs, my emotions. And I'm not saying that every person who struggles with infertility thinks this way, but this is the very common language that she is trying to call out and saying, wait a minute, this is centering the needs of the wrong person. We need to be centering the needs of the child. Finally, Katie says this in the wrap up to her article, and I do encourage you to go read the whole thing on the Federalist. Johnston wraps up by telling us that prohibiting IVF will indeed prevent children from entering the world. The stomach churning reality is IVF intentionally prevents the majority of children, it creates from entering the world already. The 2% of children born via IVF today are only a fraction of those who have had their unfortunate beginning in a laboratory. IVF is a death sentence for the majority of lives it creates. If her statistics are correct, that only 2% come to term and are born, let's double it. Let's say 4%. Okay. That still means that the default position is a lot of baby murder. It's a lot. And we have to be aware of that. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take a look at the comments here. Somebody says, sort of like child trafficking. In fact, I want to encourage you to go check out our conversation with Katie. We address that issue in detail in our conversation with her from a few months ago on all the things. You will not want to miss that section. It changed my mind about some things. Let's see here. How would you differentiate when exploitation seems to be at the heart of both? I think you're talking about between human trafficking and IVF. I think this is a bigger problem in the surrogacy conversation, but it is related to the IVF conversation too, and what Katie calls the commodification of children. So yes, Marla is saying they grade the embryos and destroy low-grade ones. Yes, that is a part of the default way of doing it. Now, I've been teasing throughout this stream that there is a narrow way of participating in IVF technology that can be seen within the bounds of historic Christianity and the pro-life movement. I want to draw your attention to this article on the Gospel Coalition website, How IVF Can Be Morally Right, by Dr. Wayne Grudem. It came out in 2019. I'm not going to take the time to read all of this, but there's some areas I agree and some areas I disagree, but I want to draw your attention to a few points. While I do believe modern medicine is in general a divine blessing and morally good, I think it's also corrupt, and I've become more skeptical of it since the events of 2020 and following. But I do agree and appreciate his point. We should treat an unborn child as a human person from the moment of conception. So this includes embryos in an IVF context. And this is the important one. Children should only be conceived by and born to married men and women. Nobody cares about this issue in big fertility. If you walk into a fertility clinic, nobody's going to ask you like, well, are you married? And we're only providing these services for male-female couples. No, this is a technology that allows anybody to conceive a baby. As long as they got the right body parts, it doesn't matter whether you're married, unmarried, married in a triplicate, whatever it is, same sex, different sex, doesn't matter. From the biblical perspective, if you're going to participate in this technology, to do it ethically, it needs to be between a married man and a woman. I would add to that now this is a controversial position. I would add to that an ethical treatment of IVF ought to include the genetic material from that married couple and not using the donations of a stranger. Now, Katie makes this case in her book, Then Before Us, and how it commodifies participants, and that there is research that it has an impact on the child. The child longs to know their biological parents, even if it was just a sperm donor or an egg donor. There's something innate in us that wants to know where we came from. And this is not like adoption where we're trying to rescue a trauma and trying to make the best of it and bring redemption to a trauma. In the IVF scenario and in the surrogacy scenario, the adults in the situation are intentionally, most of the time, introducing other adults the child has no say over. And we are separating that child from their biological parent or parents, and separating that child from the woman who carried them in her womb. And so this is, in my opinion, ethically very problematic. Now, if you go to a fertility clinic and you're a Christian couple and you're married and a male-female relationship and you can use the genetic material from those two people, I would say that helps to overcome a lot of the obstacles. Okay. And so, again, this is a controversial position. I recognize that some Christians will have differences of opinions about this, but I'm just trying to explain my reasoning, and you can read more about that in Katie's book. Katie is not in principle against all IVF. I talked to her this morning to clarify her position, and she says, no, that's not her position. She stops short of saying that she's against all IVF. She just thinks that in most cases it's not ethically done. It's possible, but it's not done. And so if you go to a infertility clinic, they're not going to sit down with you and say, well, what are your religious concerns and what are the parameters in which you want to participate in this process? You're going to have to be assertive and informed and explain to them how you will and will not participate, and whether or not you will put embryos through genetic testing or sex testing and all of that. The other big problem is the harvesting of embryos, or enough eggs to make these embryos, and then putting the embryos together. So let's say, and harvesting is a whole difficult process in and of itself. And they always want you to harvest more than they're going to implant, because they want to do these genetic tests on embryos and select the best ones and all of this. So they want to harvest, let's say, I'm going to use a hypothetical. They want to harvest 10, but maybe they're only going to implant 3. Okay, well, what happens to the other 7? Well, maybe 2 are destroyed because they're genetically inferior, or it's not the right sex. The couple wants to have boys and these are female. Okay, so maybe some are discarded, some are frozen. Well, let's say they implant 3, which they don't always implant 3. Sometimes they plant many more than 3. And then they have selective abortions later to reduce it down to a number that the woman can handle. Now, the exception being that, what was that case like 25 years ago with the woman who had like 8 children and she carried them all to term, and they had gone through IVF and they were Christians. And so they weren't going to abort any of their children. And so, like, it can be done. But if they all take the way that we were instructed in my ethics class 30 years ago, is you should only implant the number of children that you are willing to raise. Now, not all of them may survive, but to do it ethically, you need to give instructions. No, I don't want you to implant 8 unless you're okay with raising 8. Implant the number that you feel like, as a parent, you feel like you can morally and adequately handle as a parent. So you're not going to go through selective abortions. You're not going to do that. So you're going to have to be clear about how you're going to participate in the technology. Again, it's not the default. They're not going to bring it up. But then what do you do with the ones that are left on ice? Okay, if we're pro-life, if we believe the life begins at conception, you have triplets, and then 5 years later, you're like, I'm done having kids. I can't handle any more kids, but you still have 5 on ice. Then what are you doing? Well, you can donate them to research where they just basically dismember them, or you can donate them to an adoption agency. It's called snowflake adoption. But then, okay, here's my ethical problem with that, is that if you're intentionally separating this child from their parents because you harvested too many embryos, you're making a decision for that child. So you centered your own needs first to have children, and now you have these children that are frozen, and then you're going to put them up for adoption. This is where it becomes very difficult to me. And so I think that, yes, there is a way to participate with IVF that is consistent with the pro-life ethic, but you're going to have to work very hard and be very informed and explain very clearly how you will participate with this technology. And still, you might end up with frozen embryos, and you will be on the horns of another dilemma with that. No, it wasn't Octomom. It's the McCoy babies, I think, was their name. McCoy, something like that. So, okay, hopefully you found this helpful. That's kind of my attempt to lead a conversation about what's happening right now on this whole IVF issue. And so let me wrap up with this and a few thoughts of practical application and where do we go from here. And I want to make very clear, like, I am against all baby murder. I'm against baby murder. And by murder, I'm defining it as the willful, intentional taking of an innocent human life. I'm against baby murder in the womb. I'm against baby murder in petri dishes and in laboratories. I'm against baby murder that throws away embryos. To be honest, in most cases, I'm kind of against freezing embryos. This is an opinion. Christians can differ about this, but I just think that it devalues the image of God in that embryo. And I have deep concerns about the whole freezing thing. But what is the way forward? I think the number one way forward is education. We've got to raise more awareness about this because higher and higher numbers of people are participating in IVF. Christians are participating in IVF, and many of them do not really understand the technology or how it works. So I want to encourage everyone who listens to this, do some homework, research the issues, research the science, and then consider the implications of the technology in light of the biblical position, the pro-life position, and equip yourself so that when you're sitting over coffee with somebody, you're ready for that conversation. You're ready to speak into the pain of that infertile person and their struggle. You're ready to speak into that with some biblical wisdom, but also to try to guide them in a compassionate and careful conversation of the issues. If you have children or grandchildren that were conceived as a result of IVF, I want to encourage you to get into a conversation with the Lord about his truth and wisdom for you. I don't know what he has for you in that to learn. I'm trusting the Holy Spirit to communicate with you into your personal situation as you pray into that. He might call you to repent for your motives. I don't know. He might call you to some kind of repentance. But I want to encourage you not to drown in the struggle of regret. Parenting regret is some of the worst kind of regret. And God has forgiveness for you. And there is grace for you. There's compassion for you. And again, this is not a conversation about the dignity of your children or your grandchildren. This is a conversation about the human heart and bringing your thoughts, feelings, and opinions in line with the Word of God. Pastors, I want to strongly encourage you to start teaching about IVF from the pulpit and equip yourself for pastoral counseling contexts. Educate yourself on the issue, and please, I'm kind of begging you, have some courage, be a leader, and stop being vague and general in your support for the pro-life position. Be specific. If you're considering IVF, I also hope that you will educate yourself and research the issues. But those are some ways forward. I hope that you found this stream helpful. And I'm going to read through comments one more time. Okay, Susanna is asking a good question. Is it unethical for a single person adopting a frozen fertilized egg? Oh, this is such a conundrum because already we have a situation in play that never should have really been there, because we've used a technology that is in some sense unnatural. But then you get into the conversation of, well, is life better than no life and being discarded? And, I think that a case could be made for that, but then you're going into it. I would discourage, I don't know, it's a tough issue because I do think that a child has a natural human right to a mother and a father. Now, that's not to say that it always happens in every case. Some cases are painful. I grew up without a father. Divorce happens in cases of abuse and that sort of a thing. So it's not the ideal, but I think that to separate out a child from their biological parent or parents with intentionality from the beginning is kind of problematic. And so to add another wound to that child, to raise them without a father and a mother, that's a tough one for me. So I would be kind of a no, but I can understand the reasoning. It says, well, isn't it better to be raised by a single parent than to die in a lab? I can get that reasoning. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. This is helpful. Thank you. In light of all this, should it be our goal to ban IVF or call for a more ethical practice? Well, if we're far away from banning it. I don't see that in the future. But I definitely think Christians could advocate for more ethical practices of it. I think that would be a step in the right direction. But I think that that's why Katie's work is so important, she's trying to make the case that the child has rights. I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think that people have a right to children. I am not persuaded from scripture that parents have rights to children to conceive. I don't believe that. So if a child has a natural right to a mother and a father, and there's a technology that separates that child from those parents, I think that Christians need to vocally and carefully advocate against it. So that's my position. Yes, someone wants to know about my shirt. Yes, it was an exclusive during the month of May for Pride Month, and it is only available during the month of May. Our special Pride Month designs, we had one last year for June, and we had one this year for May. So it's not on the website. Okay. Lots of comments. Thank you very much, you guys. I really appreciate you being here with me and having this conversation. Children are gifts. God gives the gift. That's a good summary. Thank you, Kelly. So I look forward to your feedback. I know there was some hard things in here. I tried to cover it as best I can in a compassionate way. Send me your hate mail, your angry letters. That's okay. I can take it. But also let me know how it was helpful for you, what you learned. I would love to hear that and what you're thinking about and how maybe it made you think differently. Thank you so much for being here. I know